Please, I'm begging you. Untie it. The cowboy froze, then gave his life for the giant Apache. Witness this unbelievable, true, inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The sun had already started its slow slide behind the crimson ribs of the mesa when Elias Granger found himself knee-deep in a dry arroyo, the coarse gravel biting the palms of his hands. His hat lay nearby, sodden with sweat. The brim split at the crown from a hand-to-hand scuffle that had happened hours before, but felt like days. The desert around him did not care for the small catastrophes of men. It kept its heat, its silence, its wide, indifferent sky. Far off, a single hawk rode the thermals. Closer, the shout of men, an organized bark of intent, threaded the air and cut through the hush. He was not alone. Across the arroyo, a figure stood like something cut from a different landscape, not the lean, sun-baked shape of a frontiersman, but a man whose presence seemed to have weight enough to tilt the plain. Taz's shoulders rose and fell beneath a buffalo hide blanket, his hair a dense black fall braided and tied with bits of bone. He was older than the soldiers who would take the land by order, older than the treaty lines scrawled on brittle paper, older than the motives that had brought them to this canyon. Elias had once been taught to call him enemy. The years had taught the opposite. Between them, bound with rough hemp and knotted with a soldier's care, lay a chest the size of a man's coffin. It was varnished and iron-banded, not old, but sealed as if to hide something too valuable to trust to the world. The chest hummed, metaphorically if not actually, with a danger that made Elias's skin tighten. He had seen what greed did in other towns, men torn by right and wrong until both were unrecognizable. He had read a dozen dispatches about ordnance experts from the east and about a new kind of explosive the army called a powder of singular purpose. The chest whispered of that future like a prophet of ruin. The soldiers watched from a ridge, rifles leaning like a pack of wolves. Their sergeant smacked the dust from his gloves and chewed tobacco. His eyes were small and mean with certainty. Behind him, young replacements with the shine of uniforms too new for the land fidgeted with their belts. They had orders and they had hunger, and the law pressed hard in their chests. They did not know the place beyond. Elias's voice, when he spoke, had the rasp of a man who had learned to swallow more than he had argued. "Please," he said, "I'm begging you. Untie it." He heard his own breath like a spent rope. There was pleading in the tone and none of the posturing that comes with bravado. It was not a performance. It was a last attempt at a currency men still accepted, appeal to mercy. Taz's face betrayed nothing. The Apache's gaze fell for a heartbeat on the chest and then on Elias. Language between them had become a thin bridge, hammered together from gestures, glances, and the few words they borrowed from one another out of necessity. The soldier's sergeant decided the scene was bargaining and barked an order to advance. Elias felt the earth under his boots, as if it were the last thing he might ever touch, and made a choice that had nothing to do with orders or maps. He had seen the ways of the new weapons in a letter carried by a courier months before. Men who had been reduced to things by force, whole valleys erased by certainty. He knew what would happen if that chest opened in the wrong hands. He also knew, like a man who has watched a friend die twice in his memory, that some debts were paid in ways that left the ledger clean. "Cut the rope," he said, forcing his voice to calm. His hands trembled, and something in his chest, hot and heavy, a readiness for ending, slid into place. Behind the ridge, a volley snapped and barked, and dust rose where the bullets hit the arroyo. The sergeant's orders were crisp now. Take the chest, take the land, report the victory. Soldiers moved down in a loose file, rifles shouldered. The canyon became a staged theater. Men were actors in a script of property and domination. Elias moved in a way that belonged to years of riding, to training in 100 small combats with weather and hunger. He stood and walked toward the soldiers as if toward a scheduled meeting. His hand went to his gun but did not draw it. To draw would have been to invite senselessness. To not draw was to show a different kind of courage, one that accepts consequence. "Stay back," the sergeant shouted. Elias kept walking. The soldiers laughed at first, a harsh sound. Courage under their rules was a muscle to be measured and exercised. The laugh turned into startled silence when Elias stumbled, fainted, and then flung himself aside as if to collapse under the chest. He had not flung himself as theatrically as a man might, the way some frontiersmiths preferred drama. He did it with the economy of a man who knew the exact angle a bullet would travel. Bullets found dirt. One glad slap of lead took Elias in the thigh and sent him down to his knees. He tasted copper and grit. Somewhere in his skull, a small, stubborn voice catalogued pain and decided on priorities. The chest, the Apache, the men who did not yet know they were saving one another. Taza did not hesitate. He moved forward as a weather front moves, inevitable, carrying the weight of something older than men's rules. The Apache's fingers were quick as they worked the rope. He had seen 1,000 snares in his life. He understood knots as a man would understand prayers. Inch by inch the fibers yielded. The chest came free with a dull thud, the sound of something finite moving. Elias raised his head and watched Taza shoulder the chest. The soldier sergeant had reached for his weapon, anger turning to action. He barked a command that was mechanical and clean: fire. The world turned to a glare of smoke and pain. Elias pushed himself forward, despite the weight in his limbs. He saw the sergeant's grin like a thing made of teeth and decided that if any man was to die for this day, let it be him. He stood between the approaching soldiers and Taza, his back to the wind, his face softening into the tired countenance of a man who has accepted a ledger's last page. "Take it and go," Elias said. His voice could hardly be called a roar. It was a statement that carried the authority of someone who had already paid. "Take it and leave the canyon." The sergeant hesitated, the briefest flicker where arrogance met calculation. The boys behind him shifted, unsure what to do when a man offered his life like a toll. The sergeant was not without instincts. His hand trembled over the strap of his rifle, as if adjusting to the scale of historic decisions. He was built to follow orders, but even orders require men who can make them stick. He shouted again. The canyon answered with no sympathy. Somewhere beyond those red cliffs, they would be reporting a victory, the kind that men celebrated in taverns far from the truth. They would not remember the man who had stood in front of them unarmed. They would not mention the moment when mercy had looked them in the eye and they had fired anyway. That kind of memory lived only in the places the world forgot. He stayed there through the night, keeping watch over the stones until the stars thickened and the air turned cold. When dawn began to grey the rim of the canyon, he rose. The chest lay beside him, its iron bands glinting faintly. He touched it once, not in reverence but as a reminder. Elias had died, so that this thing would not reach the hands of men who would use it for destruction. It was not treasure. It was a curse boxed in wood and metal. Taza knew what he had to do. He fastened the chest to the back of a half-broken horse that had wandered back from the ridge. The animal was nervous, ears twitching at every sound, but it accepted his hand. Together they began the long trek north, following dry riverbeds and narrow trails that wound through the mesas. Each mile carried the weight of silence. At times he thought he could hear Elias's voice in the wind, rough, amused. The way a man might sound when telling a story he didn't expect anyone to believe. 3 days passed before Taza reached the canyon mouth that opened onto the painted desert. There the world looked endless, a sea of red and white dunes rolling toward a horizon that seemed to breathe. He stopped on a ridge where the ground was cracked with ancient lava and the air smelled of iron. Beneath his feet, the earth sounded hollow. The old stories said that this was a place where fire slept. He worked for hours, prying open a crevice wide enough to swallow the chest. When the sun stood high and unpitying, he rolled the chest to the edge. For a long moment he simply stared at it. Within its box was mankind's newest sin, powder that could erase mountains, an invention made for power and wrapped in patriotism. Elias had known it. The soldiers had known it. Only fools pretended it was progress. Taza bent low and whispered something in his own tongue, a prayer older than the border, one that asked the spirits to forgive what men could not undo. Then he pushed. The chest slid forward, struck the wall once, and vanished into darkness. He listened until the echo of its fall was gone. When he turned back, the sky had begun to change. Clouds stacked above the desert, heavy and bruised. The first drops of rain he had felt in weeks cooled his skin. He took it as a sign that the land accepted what had been done. By nightfall, he had found shelter under an overhang of rock. He built a small fire and watched the flames struggle against the wind. For the first time since the gunfight, exhaustion broke through his calm. His hand shook. He thought of the cowboy, Elias, with his half-smile, and the tired eyes of a man who had already lost too much. He thought of how their paths, drawn by hate, had crossed and then twisted into something neither of them could name. Taza reached into his satchel and drew out a small leather pouch. Inside was a folded scrap of paper, Elias's writing, the kind that men carried close to the heart. He had taken it from the cowboy's coat before piling the stones. The paper was blood-stained, but the words were still legible. If anyone finds this, tell my son the world's worth saving, even if we have to bleed for it. The handwriting staggered, letters uneven, but the meaning struck clean. Taza folded the note again and pressed it against his chest. "He will know," he said quietly. "I will see that he knows." Morning came with the rumble of distant thunder. The storm had washed the sky clean. Taza mounted the horse and set his course east toward the settlements, following the memory of trails he had avoided for years. He did not plan to stay long among the white men. He would find the boy, deliver the note, and disappear back into the land that had birthed him. Days blurred together. He traveled through abandoned ranches, burned-out homesteads, the bones of towns stripped by drought. At one lonely trading post near the San Juan crossing, he found word of a youth named Granger working freight on the rail line near Santa Fe. The clerk, a gray man with eyes dulled by dust, looked twice at the Apache before giving directions, but said nothing more. The world was tired of war. Suspicion had lost its edge. It took another week to reach the rail camp. Smoke from the engines trailed across the valley like black scarves. Taza kept to the shadows until dusk. When he finally found the young man, Thomas Granger, he saw the echo of Elias in his face, the same jaw, the same weary gaze. The boy was oiling a wheel assembly when Taza stepped from the scrub. Thomas spun, hand instinctively going to the wrench at his belt. "Who are you?" he demanded. Taza did not reach for his weapon. "A friend of your father," he said simply. The boy blinked. "My father's been missing 3 months. He is gone," Taza answered. "But he wanted you to have this." He held out the folded scrap of paper. Thomas took it cautiously. His eyes moved over the words once, twice, and then he sank to a crate nearby, the note trembling in his fingers. The camp noises faded around them, the clang of tools, the hiss of steam, until there was only the wind. "He saved me," Taza said after a moment. "Saved many others too. He chose death so that the fire in that box would never touch this land." The boy looked up, confusion giving way to comprehension. "You mean he died for you?" "For all," Taza corrected softly. "But yes, for me most of all." The silence that followed was thick, the kind that remakes the air between strangers. Thomas folded the note again, pressed it to his chest the same way Taza had, and nodded. "He'd do that," he whispered. "He always said a man's worth is measured by what he protects, not what he owns." Taza felt something ease inside him, something he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Then you know the truth," he said. "That is enough." He turned to leave, but Thomas rose quickly. "Wait, will I see you again?" "No." Taza's voice was calm, final. "But when you ride, remember this canyon and the man who stood in it." He walked away before the boy could answer. The train whistles began to cry behind him, iron beasts preparing to devour distance, and the sound followed him until it was part of the wind. From Santa Fe, he traveled south, skirting the line of new telegraph poles that marched across the desert. Civilization was crawling outward like a vine, swallowing everything it touched. He wondered how long the land would keep its silence. At night, he dreamed of Elias, sometimes laughing beside a campfire, sometimes standing on the ridge where the soldiers had shot him, hat in hand, looking out over an endless horizon. Each dream left Taza with the same feeling, that the world was thinner now, that one of its good men had been carved out of it. Weeks passed. The rains came late that year, carving fresh gullies into the plains. One afternoon, while crossing the basin near Chaco, Taza encountered a patrol of soldiers. They spotted him from a distance, raised rifles, and shouted for him to halt. He did not. He urged his horse faster, the wind roaring in his ears. Shots rang out. One struck the animal's flank. Another tore through his side. He slid from the saddle, rolled behind a rock, and returned fire with the precision of instinct. 2 soldiers fell. The others hesitated, frightened of the legend that Apaches could move like ghosts. He managed to escape into a canyon streaked with rainwater. Blood loss blurred his vision. As darkness closed in, he crawled beneath a ledge and pressed his palm to the wound. He thought of Elias again, how the cowboy had faced death with calm resolve. Now it was his turn to meet it without fear. The next morning, the canyon was quiet. A group of herders found the horse wandering and, following the tracks, discovered Taza's body half buried in silt. They built a cairn beside him, not knowing his name, but sensing that he deserved peace. Years rolled by. The railroad reached the desert towns, and the wars between settlers and tribes dwindled into treaties written in ink that faded as fast as the memories of the men who signed them. But among the older Apaches, the story of the white cowboy and the giant warrior remained. They said that on certain nights, when the wind swept through the dry riverbeds, you could hear 2 voices, one rough and one deep, speaking softly about duty, about the price of keeping the world from burning. Thomas Granger grew older. He left the rail camps, built a small homestead near the edge of the very canyon where his father had fallen. He married, raised children, and told them only fragments of what had happened. Yet whenever he passed the cairn that marked Elias Granger's grave, he paused, touched the brim of his hat, and whispered, "Still worth saving, Pa." Generations later, when settlers had become citizens and the frontier had turned into legend, a traveling historian recorded an Apache tale about 2 men who defied war's logic, one who carried a gun and one who carried a nation's memory. The historian never found proof, only a rusted spur and a piece of buffalo hide near a collapsed cairn. But the locals swore they had seen a figure on horseback riding the mesa at dusk, hat tilted low, watching the horizon as if guarding something unseen. And so the story endured, of a cowboy who gave his life for a giant Apache, and of an Apache who carried that debt through the rest of his days. The desert remembers what men forget. The wind still carries their last words, soft and pleading, over the stones of the canyon. Please, I'm begging you, untie it.